Life is like a quilt, years bound together, embellished with family and friends, backed with tradition, stitched with love, with cornerstones placed carefully to create a one-of-a-kind journey through time. Our quilt is a beautiful menagerie that began with first-generation immigrants, bringing with them their own uniqueness, courage, and resiliency. Each patch is a special memory that forms the tapestry of our lives with threads of love, hope, and compassion connecting it all. The richness of their heritage and some remarkable stories that, when sewn together, create an ever-growing masterpiece of beauty.
On August 14, 1964, a young man from Tehran, just 18 years old, saved $100 for a visa, left everything behind and courageously boarded a flight to the U.S. in search of the American dream. His first stop was Washington, D.C., where he struggled to make ends meet by bussing tables, driving a taxi, and chauffeuring dignitaries for the Togolese embassy. He soon learned that starting a new life, all alone and in a foreign land, came with its struggles.
Meanwhile, a young woman in Mexico was helping to raise her brothers and sisters while her family ran a farm in the rural working-class town of Atotonilco. She never complained of the responsibilities and expectations placed on her, but she knew she wanted more for her life and decided to go to the United States in search of a more fulfilling life. She fearlessly took the 3-hour bus ride each way to Mexico City, and after 6 rejections from the consulate, she finally got her travel visa. On May 12, 1967, she packed her bags knowing that she would never return. She headed to Washington to stay with her brother Luis and figure out how to start a new life. It was there that the two people from completely different worlds would meet. Reyna had settled in with her brother, and George was living in the apartment next door. An average day turned into a moment they would never forget when Louise asked George if he could give his sister a ride to church. Almost immediately, the two developed an interest in one another, even though they had little similarities and didn't even speak a common language. As their relationship developed, so did their unique communication style of broken English and hand gestures.
It was George's friend Fred that became the reason he took an interest in flying. After a terrifying yet invigorating flight to Virginia with Fred, George instantly had the desire to experience more. He soon found himself in Tulsa, Oklahoma, at the Spartan School of Aeronautics, where he would get his pilot's license and a jump start on his career.
After spending 7 months in Tulsa, he headed back to Washington. The couple had been dating for a year and decided it was time to take their relationship to the next step. George Manteghi and Reyna Balderrama married on July 25, 1968. Reyna's brother Luis proudly walked her down the aisle as they were surrounded by a small group of friends. It wasn't long before they started a family in Bethesda, Maryland. Their first child, Reyna Soraya, was born on March 29, 1969. While they were starting to grow roots, they were also dealing with the stress of not having a permanent visa and struggling with English as their second language. They were experiencing the hardships that immigrants often endure, but they remained committed to making a life for themselves and for their family.
They moved to Manassas, Virginia, where they welcomed the birth of their second child, George Mohammed, on April 15, 1970. George received his commercial airline license and was working 3 jobs to make ends meet. His dream was starting to take shape. Unfortunately, they were still struggling without a green card and needed to come up with a plan. Reyna was committed to raising her 2 young children the best she could while supporting her husband.
As a benefit for working for Colgan Airways, they were able to get inexpensive tickets to Iran for a visit. Unbeknownst to them, they learned that their temporary visas to stay in the United States were canceled upon leaving. George now had to figure out a way to return to the life they started in the United States. Once in Iran, George got the family settled and started to contact everyone he knew to find a way out of Iran. Reyna was faced with the unusual challenge of being a Mexican woman living in Tehran and was immersed in Persian culture and customs that were far different from what she knew.
After several unsuccessful attempts to leave the country, George somehow convinced the government to release him and his family under the condition that he would seek Muslim cleric training in Saudi Arabia. Rather than going to Saudi Arabia, George got his family to Greece instead. It was the only country that was willing to grant them a visa. Their path to Athens was a winding journey that included stops in the Arab Emirates and Egypt.
The couple sought refuge in Greece until they could figure out a way to get back to the United States. The young couple was determined to have their third child born in America, like their other two children. Reyna Soraya was already 3 years old, and George Muhammad was celebrating his first birthday. They were fortunate to befriend two Americans that were working in Athens, and upon learning about their story, agreed to talk to the U.S. consulate on their behalf. Remarkably, they managed to secure a temporary visa for Reyna and the children. Unfortunately, George was not granted the same opportunity and was left behind to try and come up with yet another plan. A pregnant Reyna did what she had to do and traveled with her two small children to New York City, where she would be reunited with Louise and return to Washington, D.C. After their flight was delayed and not knowing where they were, Louise left the airport so he could get to work. At JFK Airport, Reyna met a big-hearted priest who, after hearing about her situation, paid for airline tickets for all three of them to get to Washington. Her other brother, Petronilo, who was visiting Louise, was there to greet the family while they were waiting to hear George's fate.
Back in Greece, with the help of their two new American friends, George managed to obtain a 48-hour visa to the U.S. He arrived in Washington, D.C., and went to see Charles Colgan, president of Colgan Airways, to ask for help. Mr. Colgan was a well-connected guy and offered to contact Senator Byrd of Virginia, who managed to get George's visa extended for 30 days. At the same time, he also granted a visa for entry into Mexico as an alternative option rather than face certain deportation back to Iran. Low on money, George immediately began working 3 jobs again to save money to get to Mexico. Their third child, Violet Merriam, was born on November 19, 1971. After 30 days and with a newborn and 2 small children, George and Reyna drove to Mexico with the hope of finding a way to get back to the U.S. It was the winter of 1971. The young family arrived in Atotonilco to live with Reyna's family until they could get the needed papers to go back to the U.S. and stay permanently. For 1 month, they lived in a crowded house with the Valderrama family before moving into a 1-bedroom apartment in Pachuca. It was there that the family was showered with love and support from Daniel and Julieta Garcia. During those few months in Mexico, George took several trips to the U.S. Embassy. During one of these visits, it was discovered that one of his old flight students from back in Virginia was now working at the embassy. As if it were something out of a dream, his old friend cleared the way for the family to go back to the U.S. They left Mexico and made the long and grueling drive back to Washington. They bounced around for a short time, living with Reyna's brother Luis, then with one of George's friends, and finally with one of George's flight school students, Henry Stevenson. His friendship with Henry would later lead to a new career opportunity. George had saved enough money to move his family to a small apartment in Alexandria, Virginia. He continued working 2 jobs to support his family and remained focused on finding his next career move.
He had stayed in contact with Henry and eventually helped land him a pilot's position working in Richlands, Virginia. The family moved into a modest house in the small, peaceful mountain town. The new job required long hours and a significant amount of travel. Reyna worked tirelessly to raise their children and give them the best possible upbringing. Both remained committed to supporting their young family in every way they could. It was during this time that George faced a defining moment that would test his character and integrity. Unexpectedly, he was asked by the owner of the company to take unnecessary risks while flying the airplane. George refused and was ultimately fired from his position. Sadly, that same man and a group of passengers traveling aboard his plane would later perish in a plane crash while taking one of those same risks. Out of the tragedy rose George's reputation as being a strong and ethical pilot. Word traveled fast in the small town, and it wasn't long after being let go that he had received several job offers and ultimately chose a pilot position based in the coal mining town of Norton, Virginia.
About a year after moving, the company began struggling financially. They could no longer manage the expense of having a private plane, and George was forced to look for other opportunities. He settled on a new job as a pilot that allowed him to commute from Norton, while the company operated from Kansas and Kentucky. As George's job required him to spend a significant amount of time away from home, Reyna dedicated all her time to her children. She was resourceful in finding ways to manage homework, home repairs, and doctor's appointments. Without even having a car or knowing how to drive, she always found a way. Times would soon get tough again, as George's new company was also falling victim to the declining coal industry. George then got his first big break with a large commercial carrier, and he went to work for Continental Airlines. Things were again starting to look up for his career. The year was 1979, and the country was faced with the Iran hostage crisis. 52 American diplomats and citizens were held hostage for 444 days after a group of Iranian college students supporting the revolution took over the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Discrimination against Middle Easterners, and Iranians in particular, had become increasingly bad. He was let go from Continental simply because of his ethnicity, and was forced to pick up the pieces and find another path. Finding work as a pilot was proving to be virtually impossible. George reached out to everyone he knew to find work and was fortunate to return to work as a commuter pilot in Manassas, Virginia. Meanwhile, back in Norton, Reyna continued raising the kids and taught them the importance of being great students and having a foundation of faith.
It was there that the Manteghis would get their ticket out of the depressed coal mining town. In 1980, he would cross paths with Sid Duncan, who was so impressed with his flying ability and commitment to safety that he offered him a flying position in Greenville, South Carolina. They moved into their house on Bridle Path Lane, and they began to get comfortable with their new normal. The kids transitioned well into their new schools. Reyna continued providing them with a solid home life, and George was adjusting to the lifestyle of being a private pilot. He would spend the next 7 years flying with a few different companies until his next big break came. In 1987, George was invited to United Airlines to go through their elite qualification program in Denver, Colorado. Not surprisingly, he passed the program with flying colors and was told to go home, get his affairs in order, and prepare to move. He would finally receive the mail he was anxiously waiting for, but unfortunately, it was not the news he was expecting. United had made the decision to pass on George, and when pressed for an explanation, he was told the decision was ultimately made because he was Iranian. George was forced to see the unfortunate reality that he would continue to stare prejudice in the face, and if they were going to experience the stability they were badly desiring, he would need to take a different path.
George stumbled upon an opportunity that would ultimately give him the security he was seeking and the opportunity to demonstrate his knowledge of cars. He purchased Japan Auto Parts that, after surviving all the ups and downs of running a small business in the largest recession since the Great Depression, remains in business today after 31 years. It was during this pivotal time that the children grew up, became well educated, and each of them successful in their own right. Graduations turned into job opportunities, which turned into weddings and new family additions. Life came with its ups and downs, but they finally enjoyed the stability they worked so hard to obtain.
Both George and Reyna never stopped working hard, both inside and outside the home, to provide the kids with a solid foundation and a quality of life better than what they experienced. The beauty of parenthood led to the joys of grandparenthood. This was all confirmation that their dreams had been realized.
Our quilt is a wonderful reminder of where we started, how we started, and why the journey was so important. We are grateful for the opportunities we have. It was that, after all, that started the journey to begin with.
Our quilt recognizes those that helped us along the way. They were there for us to lend a helping hand during the times we most needed them. We will always celebrate them. They were our guardian angels.
Our quilt symbolizes our rich and beautiful heritage. It is what makes us unique and has taught us that love and friendship have no borders. Prejudices will always exist, but our tale proves its illegitimacy.
Our quilt celebrates the beauty of a mother's love. It is endless and unconditional. It is the glue that holds the family together. It signifies strength, kindness, and devotion. It's in the food she cooks and the blankets she knits.
Our quilt represents a father's influence. It teaches us to be strong and independent. It demonstrates the importance of providing for your family at all costs. It reminds us to have and maintain a global mindset and not fall victim to radical beliefs, and to always think for ourselves.
Our quilt teaches us that sometimes it's the journey that ends up teaching us about our destination. It demonstrates how fear and struggle are no match for courage and determination. We are grateful for the life we enjoy and recognize that it didn't come without great sacrifice. It is what gives us strength.
Our quilt symbolizes the many traditions that have been built along the journey. We understand the importance of not letting them fade, and while new ones will develop, the old ones will remain. While Family Night Fridays may sound insignificant, its impact on all of us can't be understated.
Our quilt recognizes the adversity we have faced in our lives. All of the troubles and obstacles have strengthened us. We may not realize it when it happened, but helped to shape our lives and open the door for future generations.
Our quilt tells our story. It represents the hard times, but also the countless funny moments that we enjoyed together. There is pain, but also overwhelming sweetness.
Our quilt is a work in progress, of which we will continue to write history and create new memories. While everything in life is not scripted or planned, it has created an amazing tapestry that will live on.
Our quilt is a tribute and a gift. It will be passed on and talked about for generations to come. It signifies our story, from which many beautiful stories will be written.